a big North Carolina connection in this group.
3/4 of us.
3 out of 4.
Yeah.
And I'm connected,
amazing, you guys.
And I'm connected to the Midwest too, because I was born in the Midwest. So.
All right, got a Sheboygan in the house. Okay.
Oh, we got somebody up late in the UK. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, hi.
Oh, Diane
Again?
in Milwaukee with me. That's awesome.
Oh, Sarah Hibbert, glad you could join us.
There's another Durham person.
Hi.
Heidi, if you're the host, do we need to spotlight the 4 of us on top?
Yeah, we are co-hosts.
Okay.
But yeah, we can.
Just as we jump in.
Spotlight us, but then remember, you guys can toggle between the gallery view and the speaker view, and that way you can choose to see everybody or see just us. So I'm going to spotlight Zach too. Oh, there we go. We got it. We got a lot of hosts in the room.
Full screen. Well, let's go ahead and jump in if that's all right with everybody.
Oh yeah, we got a burning question for you guys.
Yeah. So the first question was just a warm up, easy peasy, just to warm up your fingers. The second question is the one we're really interested in knowing, and that is, what's the weirdest thing you've ever repurposed? Type that in the chat for us, please.
I even knew what this question was, and I didn't think about it. You know, I've got to
right. We have our own answer.
In the chats,
I think Sherri is going to win.
No. I put mine in though. I have one thing that I forgot that I put in an old art quilt. I'll just type it in there.
Fur. That is an amazing repurpose.
What is that?
Someone repurposed cat fur.
Oh, wow.
You did 200 pairs of underwear. That is pretty impressive as well.
I've got some onion bags I've been collecting. I can't wait to do something with. Socks. So I put barbed wire in a quilt once.
Oh.
Whoa.
That's my early rebellious days.
How's that work for you at night, Sherri?
Right?
I one time got handed a bunch of snakeskin scraps from a fashion designer.
Wow.
And learning how to sew snakeskin was a trip. There's zero forgiveness. There's zero stretch. Like, it's just.
No, there would
Does it hold together then? Can you even sew through it? Is it like paper?
Yeah. You just use long stitches. So similar to sewing any leather, just long stitches and really precise cutting to make it fit.
Huh.
I love seeing all these things, wine corks. I love seeing all these different things. That's
Amazon
fabulous.
Packaging paper.
Cool.
You know, I think there's 4 hosts here, but we're in good company. I mean, y'all as an audience bring with you so much experience already. And as the 4 of us present, there will be, hopefully, we've come up with a schedule for tonight, and we're going to do our best to stick to it, to allow a good 25 minutes at the end for question and answers. So be thinking as each of us share and talk, if there's anything that we need to elaborate on or something that you can bring into the conversation, we'd love to hear it.
All right.
Shall we begin our intros?
Let's start, because we got a lot to share.
Good stuff. All right. I'll go first because I'll be speaking first. My name is Zach Foster. If we haven't met before, nice to meet you. I work almost exclusively with Repurposed Materials. So this is a Zoom talk near and dear to my heart. I think I got into Repurposed Materials because of anxiety and being a tightwad, because I would go to the fabric store and I would spend a very anxious hour or two looking at all the bolts of fabric. And it was just too much to have to pick at one time. And then I would buy the fabric, spending too much money, come home, and I just couldn't bring myself to cut into perfectly good fabric that I just paid too much for. And so I think both of those things drove me to fabric that at the time I thought had lesser value just because the price tag was either free or lower. But in the meantime, I've come to realize that I think repurposed materials actually have more value than some of the things we can buy from the store. So that's me, that's where I'm coming from. Like I said, most of my stuff is repurposed. I do a lot of modern improv quilts, memory quilts, and lately burial quilts. That's for another Zoom talk. I'll send it over to Heidi.
All right, I am Heidi Parks. I live in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I do a lot of improvisational quilting and quilts that are kind of fluid in the art world, maybe more for the wall than to be used mostly. And I got real excited about repurposing materials in like 2014 when I was thinking a lot about the shift that I made from being a high school art teacher to being a professional quilter. And I wanted to have more meaning in my work. And I thought, I'm going to highlight one repurposed item in each quilt, and that's going to be the star of the show, and it's going to help do some storytelling for me. And now I oftentimes have more than one repurposed item, but that concept of telling the story with the history of that unique item was really inspiring to me initially. Okay, and then over to Luke. Luke, we can't hear you.
I'm muted. That way the dog didn't bark. I didn't want to interrupt anyone. Oh, hi, I'm Luke Haynes. Welcome, everyone. Good to chat. I'm living in Kansas City by way of every major city in the country. So, you know, I sort of circled the edges and ended up in the bullseye. I'm coming. So my jam with quilting is the conversation about kind of objectness and then the architecture of utility. So repurposed is just right in there with me because it's the conversation about the history of the object, and even more with what we're making, the history of the objects that made the then object. So, you know, the clothes, the type of material, the stitching, the fabric, whatever. Now there's this bigger conversation. And then what does that thing get to be used for, done with, experienced? So, Sherri.
Excellent. Well, I first started making, you know, when I was a brand new quilter, I was just excited about all the fabric I could find in the fabric store, right? And then that was back in 1989. and actually there wasn't as much then as there is now. And I then started, you know, I was really influenced by art quilters, and I used all kinds of materials. You know, they weren't functional quilts, but I had organzas and just all kinds of different stuff I would use. And I sold at a farmer's market. I don't know if people knew that. For like 13 years, I sold my wares my quilts at the local farmer's market. And one day somebody came to me and said, you know, I have my grandmother's clothes that I would really like to have a quilt made out of. And it completely changed my life. I got rid of so many shelves of materials because up until that point, I felt like, well, I was already feeling this before that person came into my life. But I felt like I was just consuming and making products and consuming products. And it wasn't very fulfilling. There was parts that were fulfilling, but it was getting kind of old. And when she asked me to do that, I just was like, it was so meaningful to work with these materials. And it was just a gateway into a whole new perspective on my quilt practice. And, you know, I realized that my practice was more about service. It was more of a service-oriented practice than, you know, a product type practice, and also a healing practice, which my own getting into quilting was about healing, but then working with healing with others. So that's kind of where I jumped off into, and that was in 2000. And so I've been, you know, working with this and thinking about it for quite a bit of time. And right now I'm located in Cincinnati. I've also added more in the middle. I guess I'm still a little bit more East Coast now. And so I'm really happy to be with you guys. I'll share more about my story when my turn comes up.
All right, and Zach better unmute. He is going to kick us off with his talk. Yep. And I'm seeing Samantha is knitting, and just want to acknowledge that we have 203 people here right now. So thank you guys so much for showing up live. And if I wasn't presenting, I would 100% be working with my hands right now too. So thank you for sharing that and having your video on to share that also.
Yeah, that's the problem with Zoom. You can't hide anything, right? Like, we see you. We see you.
Oh, I'm wearing pajama pants. I'm hiding something, Zach.
Yeah. What do you think these are? Sweatpants, folks. One of these days, we'll all be in the same room together and we won't be wearing pajama pants and sweatpants. But until that day, let's make the most of this. All right. 1 second while the internet catches up with the human brain, and we will begin. Yeah, Sherri, when you were sharing a bit of your story, it reminded me that I had kind of an aha moment when it came to repurposed fabric, which was I realized that all the store-bought fabric that I was bringing home had consequences, right? Like it was dyed and starched and shipped and all these things that weren't necessarily good for the home that we call Earth, you know? And I couldn't abide the idea that something that I love and I'm dedicating so much of my life and energy to, quilting, I couldn't abide the idea that it was somehow harmful to the place we live. So that's when I made my switch into a more sustainable way. I'm not gonna say I'm 100% repurposed. I still have stuff in my chest of drawers over here that I bought from the store a while back, or it was gifted to me, but for the most part, I really enjoy working with repurposed materials. And recently, and I mean like in the last 2 months, some of you who follow me on Instagram know this, I had kind of a shift in my thinking about when should we repurpose and when should we not repurpose? It had never occurred to me, I'm just being transparent here. It had never occurred to me that maybe we shouldn't just cut up every piece of material that comes our way. So I wanna start my part of the chat by saying, here's maybe when we should pause before we cut into something. And it was this conversation that I was having with folks online about all these Fresh Direct bags. If you live in a city where Fresh Direct exists, and if you live in a big apartment building like I do, you will see these in the trash on the daily basis. They are single use, high, heavy duty, wonderful bags, but the company will not take them back. And they ask people to dispose of them properly. And so what I started doing was I just started taking them out of the trash can, the clean ones. And I asked the folks on Instagram, I'm like, what can we do with this? You know, like what are some creative ideas? You know, should I make a raincoat or what? And people said, well, I hear the food banks can use them. And it dawned on me, oh yeah, wait, these bags are still really like useful for the thing they were designed to do. And so I'm not gonna say that I have this new rule about repurposed material, but I do take a pause to ask, can somebody else use this just the way it is? And if so, how can I get it to that person? If not, game on, where are my scissors? Similarly, I was helping a customer just yesterday go through her closet because I'm making a memory quilt for her mother who passed away. And we were deciding which of her mother's clothes from the closet might go into it. And our rubric or our calculus turned out to be that, because some of the stuff was hard for her to part with, you know? And so we settled on the question, well, if it's clothing that you would personally wear someday, like maybe you can have it tailored, or maybe you can change that dress into a skirt. If you can use it for yourself, then how about you keep it? If you don't see yourself ever able to wear it, how about we put it into the quilt? And so that was a way we were able to kind of settle that question for ourselves as we moved through that conversation. So I leave that with you there. Similarly, maybe we don't have to cut things up to repurpose them. I'm thinking of a couple of whole quilt tops that I've repurposed, if we want to use that word, in the last year. This one was a piece that Roderick Kirchhoff sent me, made in the mid 1950s. And I thought it was a perfect fit for this idea that I was finding myself contemplating over and over in the last couple of years, which is why, if America is as wonderful as people say it is, do we not have some of the nice things that other countries have? And it makes me wonder, what were people in the 50s thinking was holding us back? What were people in the 60s thinking was holding us back? And are these problems perennial? And I like the connection between the message and the original quilt from the 50s or the 60s. Here's a second vintage quilt that I've repurposed. This one's much older. This is probably from the third quarter of the 1800s. I love this one fully intact, just a few light mends here and there to try to preserve the story of the quilt itself. I love seeing the patches that were made on the quilt by somebody else other than me. You can see here that the jean patch, very roughly sewn down, but it's there. And then the repurposed bit were the lettering that I appliqued on top from old bed sheets. Recently made a jean quilt. I felt like cutting them up would be somehow disidentifying what the origin of the fabric was. And for those of you who were with me for that conversation online, I got this box of jeans from a jean company, and they said, could you make us a quilt out of them? I said, sure, no problem. I can make a quilt out of anything. But when it showed up at my doorstep and I saw all these brand new jeans that looked like they were 30 years old, I was like, oh no, I can't somehow pull some smoke and mirrors trick here and greenwash this thing. And so talking with Heidi quite a bit about this one, I decided to leave them basically whole, as you see here, so they are readily identifiable as jeans. This is a project that never came to be, but it lives in my mind in this kind of outsized way. And it was, I walked around Brooklyn for a month, picking up every piece of textile I could find. Yes, they all got washed, FYI. I know there's been some concerns on Instagram. I've seen some of that chatter. I basted all the pieces down in ways that somehow mirrored how I found them or captured, the body that might be wearing these. And the idea was to make this big, wonderful quilt. But the problem was, folks, I just found way too many clothes. Once you start looking in a place like New York for trash, seek and ye shall find. I found it. And so this was going to be about 3 king-size quilts here. This gives you kind of a scale. And it just got overwhelming. So I just had to say, I got other things to work on. So I packed it up and I put it in the textile recycling bin. But there it is. Maybe I'll pick it back up one of these days. And I posted about this recently. This is a bandana that my dad had and did yard work in for many years. And then I kind of took it to college with me, and I've had it for many years. And it's really threadbare now and starting to fall apart. Wouldn't even be good in a quilt because it's so thin. But I just did some tiny tacks and hand stitches to make this kind of organic improv shape that I'm calling flat press fabric. When I ask folks online, what do you want to hear us talk about? One of the biggest topics was, how can we mix textiles of different fibers and different weights? And I'm not sure I'm the expert, but I'm glad I'm going first so I can put this question in the minds of the other 3 presenters, and maybe y'all can touch on that with yours. I would just say, play around. There are no rules, right? But one thing that I have discovered is that this quilt, I think, is a good representation of quilts that have different weights to them. And so if you look here, for example, you see some denim beside some linen that was pretty light. And I would just say, when it comes to pressing the seams, I always tried to press the seams so that the heavy fabric laid flat, that it was a thinner fabric that folded into the seam, if that makes sense. That's one tip for you. And I see that my time is almost up. So I would like to get us to this. How do we tap into the value of repurposed materials? It's a trick question because I don't know, other than just to tell you to be mindful and to be present and to ask questions of your fabric. My mom came to visit me a few years ago, and she was the first artist I ever knew. She's a calligrapher. And then after she left New York, I sat down and made this piece out of old shoestring material. And I don't think I would have ever made it if my mom hadn't come and spent a few days with me and left me her calligraphy vibes, It became a larger piece in this Oh America quilt that you can see in the bottom right-hand corner. And then I'm gonna close on one last story. And you may have heard me tell this before, but I love it because it still gives me the goosebumps. I recently had a commission to do 3 memory quilts for the same person. And I went and picked up the clothes from the folks that live down in Charleston. And it was like 3 or 4 trash bags full of his old dress shirts. And by the time I made 3 quilts, I'd spent 3 or 4 months with this guy's clothes and talking to these people and hearing stories and all this. I mean, this space that I'm sitting in now, the studio, was just saturated with his presence. His name was Trey. This place was just saturated with Trey's presence in some way. And the 3rd quilt, which would be this one, I had kind of a metaphysical, mystical connection with it, in that you can see that the 3rd quilt is pretty different from the first 2 in style. And And as I always do with clients, I sent them kind of a mock-up first and said, let me know what you think. I know it's a little bit different, but you know, maybe I only like it because it reminds me of sea glass. And when I was a kid, I'd collect sea glass on the beach and then line it up in order of shape and all that, you know. And they wrote me back real fast saying, well, that was one of Trey's favorite things to do, was to collect sea glass on the beach. And just telling y'all that, like, I still get the chills, you know? So I don't know what to say other than clothes that we live in are very special. Clothes that someone else has lived in are very special. And as artists and creatives, we can tap into that if we're open to that direction of energy. And I'm gonna leave it there. Thank you very much. Heidi is up next.
Yeah, thank you, Zach.
Fabulous, Zach.
Yeah, that reminds me of 2-3 years ago, I heard Sherri Lynn give her lecture about repurpose memory quilts. And you just gave me such beautiful permission to take my time around repurposing my dad's clothing after he passed away in 2018. And you know, they're such potent items, and it really meant a lot to me that you said to, like, take your time. You don't have to do it this year. And I think Zach's story for me speaks to that concept too, of you got to just feel into when it's right. Exactly. Yeah. So for me, thinking about repurposed materials, this is my mom's tablecloth that we had at most of our Thanksgivings growing up, and all the holidays, etc. And it had some, my mom likes to joke about who might've left a gravy stain or a wine stain or whatever that was on this, this tablecloth. And she moved to Florida, and I changed my career. It was 2014, and I was living in a different place. And she gave me this tablecloth because she thought, I'm not going to use it anymore. I will never again have a big table like that. And I thought, well, I sure don't have a big table like that, and I don't really see myself being able to do that. So I thought she gave it to me to cut up to make a quilt. Well, I posted my delighted photos on Instagram, and my mom and my cousins and everyone were like, you cut up your mom's. It was just like they were horrified, and my mom couldn't believe that I had done it. So it was a lesson to me in making sure I really articulate what exactly are your intentions in giving me, a quilter, this piece of fabric. But since then, I think my mother has made peace with this quilt, and it's one that I've continued to add this quilt, this tablecloth, to lots of quilts since then. And it's really very special to me. And it was one of those pivotal conversations that I had when I was getting some alumni advice at the Art Institute of Chicago, where I was a student, and we had that discussion around using one specific item to really bring home and tell a story powerfully. And for me, this tablecloth was that kind of potent item that really tells a deep story. So I love that about this quilt. Another quilt that tells a story in that kind of a way is this quilt, where I used a yellow polka dot skirt. I don't have a picture of me in the skirt, unfortunately, but I bought it around 2010 or 11 from Ann Taylor Loft. And that was when I was dyeing my hair platinum blonde and was a teacher and just had a really different energy in my life. And I was thinking in 2018 about how much things had changed since then. And this quilt was me really looking and noticing what is the difference between who I am now and who I was then. And as I looked back, there were these little like bits of artifacts that reminded me of who I used to be and how much I had changed. And that skirt that had never fit me well, it was always too small, and then it was very much too small when I cut it up. Just thinking about that energy. And so I used these transparent fabrics to be able to look back and give the viewer a similar experience of the archaeology of the quilt, and me looking at my home and looking back at who am I, who was I. So that idea of an artifact, but then also found and repurposed items can create surprises and unexpected innovation. For me, this quilt that's behind me is a big example of that, because I used a lot of things in the shape that I found them in. So for example, this is a dress that I bought on a family vacation that wasn't particularly fun in Missouri. And I had worn the dress for a long time, but again, it didn't fit anymore. And I'd already used the outside in one of my night flight quilts. And I thought, well, here, let me use the lining and let me not cut up or remove the evidence of what it was. This piece of fabric as well, I got at a rummage at the Wisconsin Museum of Quilts and Fiber Art, and I loved the shape it was when I found it. And I would have never thought to cut up that shape myself. As I continued to add to the quilt, I used all these little bits and bobs and scraps from mending, where the patch was a little big and I did the mend, and then I cut away this little 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch that was extra. And those got layered underneath some silk, as well as it was the first time that I ever used my little ball jar of thread scraps that Zach gave me the idea to do that. He posted about it on Instagram at some point. So it was the first time I thought, oh, these really add to the meaning of the piece. And it can be about looking for evidence, scraps, leftovers, things that I may or may not be willing to settle for. So it's a quilt that I love, as well as this vignettes quilt. It's the quilt pattern that I released this year, and it talks about the postmodern principle of art of appropriation and recontextualization, and using found objects, I think, can spark creativity. And so within myself following this pattern that I wrote, it caused me to use a lot of items from the Quilt Museum rummage and this handkerchief and some other found things in unexpected ways. So here's an example of the quilt pattern. And then here it is from our soft bulk talk in that beautiful 3D state. My fourth principle is that repurposed materials can tell a story with greater detail. And this is a quilt that I made while I was traveling in India. And certainly I've been thinking about that so much the last couple of weeks with everything that's been going on right now in India. And my heart just goes out to them after having especially gotten to be there. And while I was there, I wanted to document the experience as vividly as I could. And I used found materials, and often materials that I got for free, like this gray sheeting calendar insert. I saw it at a distance in a store. I thought it looked amazing. And they were like, well, we don't sell that. It's just free. So I got it. And they are doing incredible work at getting rid of single-use plastic. But then the inverse of that is much like what Zach discussed, where then a lot of things are given to you in more permanent materials. So I had 2 of these orange bags from buying jewelry. I have this other bag from jewelry. I have this label, but the richness of storytelling that it created was really remarkable, of having items that I found. And then my last concept is that repurposing can help create space and be good for the environment. So these vases that I've made recently, oh, I got a little video for you. I'm making them around repurposed glassware that would have gone in the garbage. And when I make a quilt, I end up with these little 2-inch strips of cotton batting from when I've made the quilt, and I quilt all over, and I feel guilty, so I don't throw it away. But then what do I do with these 2-inch strips of batting? And they are working really beautifully as stuffing inside of the vessel. And I can use it almost like a dress form as I add the fabric around the exterior. So those are my 4 principles. And Luke will be our next speaker.
Well, I got some. Just jump right in it.
Wow, this is like a whirlwind. Woo! I can't even keep up with it all.
We want to have a Q&A.
4 of us in an hour. We're going to have to tell people to bring their seatbelts next time.
I know.
So I will jump right in. Let's see, share screen.
Oh, and thank you, Penny and Marie, for your beautiful comments.
All right. Can everyone see that, Heidi?
Oh yeah, sure can.
Oh, good. Okay, good. I just wanted to start here. So I'm going to just go through a couple of my projects here. I just went through kind of my catalog today in making some slides for this to just talk about some of the characters of repurpose. And, you know, I make a lot of work that is the sort of filter experience of me going through an idea. So the object at the end kind of is a representation of the process. So I just wanted to kind of show some of those objects. But at first wanted to kind of say that, you know, where it came from can be as impactful as where it goes. You know, the fabric itself, kind of like Zach was saying, can have a story and a spirit to it that you could then make an object from, and then the object can go on into the future. And that's kind of the softball conversation where we started this. But you know, talking about where the material came from to begin with, I think is also can be very impactful. So here's a quilt that I made lots of years ago of clothing. It's just clothing stuck together, quilted, and kind of called it done. And then here's another quilt made of found fabrics, and vastly different, right? I mean, these were found garments, all these tie-dye, and then the background was found fabric I found in a barn somewhere. This quilt is repurposed clothing. So all of that is just clothing that I got from Goodwill, cut into pieces and sewn back together. So each of those, as you come forward, you get these sort of micro stories of this experience of fabric purchased from Goodwill. Here's me being a big old ham. I did this project in Seattle, but so, you know, scale wise, this repurposing of these Afghans, I mean, again, this is all from secondhand bins, so by the pound, stuff that was going to be shredded or baled or shipped out. Like, you know, it had already gone through opportunities for people to purchase or use it, so it was just going to be discarded. So I covered an entire house in these Afghans. And another project here where I covered the entire inside of another property with clothing. And so the conversations here talking about that kind of repurpose, I wanted to bring into the conversation the idea of kind of history of material, of understanding. I mean, certainly when it comes to quilting, you know, it's like clothing makes a great historical material, but there's sheets, there's a lot of material that we experience on the daily that we can fold into our work or reference in our work. And you know, talking about some of that in these kind of projects I've done over the years. Here's some coffee bags. I lived in Seattle, so these are the bags that coffee got imported in, and I put Seattle icons on them and quilted them all down. And then this project right here is talking about repurposing in a sense of trying to capture someone's spirit almost in real time. The idea being that I asked someone to sit for a portrait and then leave me what they were wearing. Underwear. And so then I made their portrait out of their own clothing. And then I put that portrait of them on top of this log cabin of clothing from the city they live in. So it's this sort of micro, macro, discard, fabric, clothing conversation, kind of trying to capture the ethos, spirit of an individual on top of this kind of field of environment. Here's another woman from that project. Here she is in her dress. I'll go back. You can kind of see that dress there, and then how the dress has gone to make her figure. A little bit of that detailing. And then the last one right here is another guy, you know, so he's being a goober standing on the chair, and he had these khaki shorts and a Hawaiian shirt on. And so I made him and bound it in that. And the background is all of that discarded clothing from the city he lived in. So it's this conversation of repurposing the clothing, his own clothing on top of discarded clothing to create this sort of narrative of this human that I was representing in the quilt. And all right, that is me, and I am going to stop sharing. There we go. So that's, oh, Heidi, you're paused for me, girl. I can't hear you.
You win for going fast. We get to have some little chit chat.
Zoom through some projects because I want to hear what Sherri has to say, but also just kind of touch on the ideas of some of the histories and stories and spirits of material. So, I mean, I want to kind of put out that line, the fishing line towards the Q&A afterwards.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, you know, one of the things that's really clear about working with repurposed materials is that, you know, Luke, you showed really well, is that and Zach and Heidi, there's personal and cultural meanings beyond just color and design and pattern with quilting. We bring in these other layers of humanity and connection and relationship. And I also find, I mean, I know this was the case for myself, and I've heard others share this, and just by listening to your talks too, that it's also a gateway to creative agency. I think there's something about working with repurposed materials that it starts to connect pretty deeply. And you know, we all come at it in a different way, but there's something there that draws, I think, our creativity and our truth out by using these materials. I guess I will share my screen, and I hope it works.
There we go.
All right. Can you see the next one? Geez, Ben?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So, I want to say when I've, you know, come to the idea of making do, I've, you know, really got this. Oh, I got to go back. From the Geez Ben Quilters have been the biggest influence for me in this area, and I took a workshop at QuiltCon when the Geez Ben Quilters were there. And you guys know how many things are on a supply list when you take a workshop, right? Like I have at least a dozen different tools listed and all kinds of specifics about materials. Well, the Geez Ben supply list for their workshop at QuiltCon was old clothes and a pair of scissors. That's all you really need, folks. I mean, a sewing machine too. Of course, at QuiltCon, they provided sewing machines, but that just like lit my imagination up. And, you know, they just said, as we were starting to do this, they just said to us, you know, just start sewing. You know, that's the spirit of making do, that you have all that you need. This idea of sustainable sewing is for you and it's for others. And this is from a conversation, a Zoom talk I went to recently with Mary Margaret Petway and Loretta Petway Bennett. And I just love some of the things that they said. The breeches leg quilt and shirt tail quilt uses natural lines of breeches. We just did it quick. We use the shapes that are already there. Let the shape make itself. Let them shape the way the clothes are made. And, you know, this idea that not just the materials, you know, they have shapes and things. Like the making do was like, it's a collaboration with your materials. It's not just you controlling the materials. Materials speak to you, even in regards to shape. And creativity has no bounds to the look or weight or kinds of materials. I love that by Mary Margaret Petway. Creativity has no bounds. So for those of you who are concerned with different weights and mixes of materials, it has no bounds. You can use whatever. You use your lycra, leopard skin, bikini that you don't fit into anymore. Put that in your quilt and you can make it work. You'll figure it out. There's no bounds. Another wonderful quote, the colors and materials take you where you need to go. And so with these, when you have these, these materials, not only, they're just not like lots of voltage, like, just big rectangles or big, long, fat quarters. They have this history, they have these shapes, and that's going to take you where you're going to need to go. And I also want to just bring this up right now that Bend Quilters need support, believe it or not. They need support. So if you've enjoyed this talk and been for free, I want to invite you guys to go on and share some of your resources. Instead of buying two new yards of fabric, send them $25 because that's how much 2 new yards of fabric will cost. And so I just want to encourage you guys, sustainable sewing is about you. It's for you. It wakes your creative agency up. It's also for others. And so I want to just a little bit, Recology San Francisco. I did a 4-month residency at the dump where my goal was to make a whole body of work, of art, of quilts out of things I scavenged from the dump. And this is what the dump looks like. It's not like a thrift store. It's just like, get that blanket right there. See that pretty material right there that's just been thrown away? Grab what you can that's on the floor. You weren't allowed to climb up. There's me with some of the stuff gleaned out of the dump. And here it is, like here, I'm already building my dump stash. You can see all the kinds of stuff. So battings, everything, battings, the material, the backings, the fabrics, the thread, everything had to come from the dump. And I found tools, I found everything I needed. So another thing about sustainable sewing and the practice of making do is you're not alone. And things come to you, things find you. If you're thinking about what you want to do with your next quilt, just go to your neighbors and say, do you have any clothes that you're going to throw away or you want to take to the thrift store? And then make a quilt out of that. I bet you'll be surprised at what a treasure you'll find and how exciting your creativity will be ignited by that challenge. I'm going to show you a few pictures of some of the things I made at the dump, but I've been doing a whole series this whole winter online called The Practice of Making Do. They're based on some of the quilts that I made during my residency, but also including a lot of the student work. And I just want to, go through this pretty quickly. So I'm going to move fast to just ignite your imagination about the possibilities. People recognize what this material is. At the dump, we had to wear safety gear. So these are our safety vests and some of the Recology uniforms and things like that. And I do improv in case you don't know. Oh, breeches quilt. Okay, well, R.B. Williams transformed us to breeches quilt. R.B. Williams is just a genius. Look her up online. There's a great YouTube video of her sewing. Look at these amazing quilts. Breeches, I found some military uniforms, and that's my breeches quilt. I didn't teach a workshop on breeches quilts this time around, but anatomy of a men's shirt. Men's shirts, they're ubiquitous. There's so many. Well, they may be becoming more extinct, but there's still a lot around right now. And they're beautiful fabrics, luxurious fabrics. All these shirts came from the dump. There's, hidden geometry. I like to, again, as Zach was talking about, when do we cut things up and letting them speak? I like to work with the natural shapes of the materials. It's me collaborating with the materials. So I don't have to decide everything. I can, the pants quilts were like that too, the breeches quilts. The shirt sleeves, the pits. This is called the pits. And then these are some from my workshop and from my the Brave Patch School is a learning community for improv quilters. And these are all people that took workshops, making do workshops, and posted things in the Brave Patch School. Look at this out of men's shirts. I love this. I love this by Lucy McCauley. Another men's shirt quilt. I love this. And you see the natural arm shapes. So interesting and so inventive. Another one, another men's shirt by Mary Whitaker, working with the natural shapes. Pocket quilts. Oh, there's so much you can do with a pocket. What would you keep in a pocket, right? What would you put in a pocket? Rosie Lee Tompkins, genius master quilter. Here's a pocket quilt. Here's some other things she's done with breeches and pocket quilts. Now, this is one of mine. And this is a group community quilt we did at Recology, and everything came from the dump. Not just the pockets, but the table and the chairs and the basket and the sewing machines and the iron and the ironing board and the scissors. I think I brought my own rotary mats. That's the only thing that didn't come from the dump. Here's some of the people in Brave Patch that took the workshops working with pockets. Sherri Schumacher, Patty Moreno, beautiful. Another Lucy McCauley piece. Look at this. I love this invention. So the practice of making do and sustainable sewing is about being resourceful and, you know, figuring it out. There's no, I think, Zach, you said this, there's no rule book on this. We just figure it out. And there's something so satisfying about figuring it out on your own. And it's just empowering. So here's a beautiful, this is a checks, working with all different kinds of materials. Let's use our velvets and our cottons. And I love the sense of scale in this one. Yeah? The corduroy. I love, this is the one I made in the workshop, and you can see a little bit of my mess here, which I wanted to share with you. But you can see how the light glances off of this. I love mixing the satin with the corduroy especially. So there's things you can do, and we can talk in the Q&A about some of the technical stuff. So here's some student work. Isn't this beautiful? The checks, and I love like, probably some linen here, and she's got some crushed velvet. Another wonderful check quilt out of corduroys and satins. So much can be done. Family linen remix, and I'm glad, I think, Luke, did you talk about the different kinds of materials we can have? Again, Rosie Lee Tompkins, a genius of this type of all kinds of improv quilting, using all kinds of linens from the home, embroideries. I just love this piece. Look at that kitty up there. This was, you know, one of the things, old curtains, old faded curtains. A lot of times the reason something is discarded is where the beauty is of the piece that we're using. And we just have to pay attention and listen. We just need to listen, read the materials, let them talk to you. So I was cutting this up into strips to use as binding, and I saw, you know, I saw this fade. I didn't see it as much in this until I cut it up. And then I saw that the faded part, the reason these curtains were discarded, that sun fade, that time, the flaw was what made it so sublime and beautiful. So family linen remix. Oh, and this is the batting, you know, take apart mattress pads and stuff. They're pretty easy to take apart, and you've got some batting right in there. Here's some student work again. Sherri Schumacher. I mean, when I say student, I don't really mean student. I mean participants, because I'm learning as much from the quote students as they're learning from me. And that's the beauty of improv, and also from the materials. I love the way that she worked with these overlays of the hankies. Another beautiful remix of different kinds of family linens by Clarissa Pytek in Brave Patch. And this one just finished. I don't have any student work, But the memory lane t-shirt quilt, why do we have to have t-shirt quilts and blocks and logos when in reality, our t-shirts are our most active wear type of material that we use? Let's have them move around. Let's have them be active like our lives are active. And honestly, we can still read these just fine, especially if they're your t-shirts. You're going to be able to look through this, and the mixing of them allows more memory to come in because you become more engaged. When you just see a big wall of square logos, it just is just kind of a little deadening in some ways. So I think, don't be afraid to be creative with these materials. Here's some of the t-shirts, and this is, to the that was a simple version. It can be much more complex what can happen with this. And this is a memory quilt for my friend Mary, whose son died at 15. And these are all his t-shirts and his baby onesies and, toys. When he was a kid, he liked to dress as Huck Finn for Halloween, and he had this Huck Finn doll. And these jeans and this jeans and the plaid shirt are the clothes that he actually died in. So you can see a detail of that. He was a skateboarder too. Here's Mary wrapped up in the quilt. Such a healing act to make a quilt. So it's such an embodied way to heal from loss. And this is another memorial memory bereavement quilt, again with this technique of mixing clothing up. And it's all about relationships, folks. It's all about the relationships of the materials. So it's the person, the father died. He was a sea captain. He had 2 young children. And we've got some of his children's clothes mixed into these too. Okay, Field of Jeans is coming up. If you missed the Making Do workshops, it's coming up. And Loretta Petway Bennett again. Field of Jeans, Stella Mae Petway, the masters of improv and repurposing and making do and resourcefulness. And I think there's just a debt owed to their imagination and creativity. At least for me, I'm just so inspired. So here is my Field of Jeans idea of using sashing. This is one way to deal with thicker materials. Use a thinner sashing. That's what we're going to be doing in this workshop to create panels. And then, these, I actually did quilt through the denim, but you can make enough sashing where you can just quilt through the sashing and not have to quilt through the denim. And notice it's really pretty to have the flaws incorporated and the worn spaces, I think, are so meaningful. But all these materials came from the dump. I especially wanted to point out what's the back. This cotton comforter was the backing and the batting for this quilt. And Sandra Lee is going to be our guest speaker. I've had a different guest speaker for each one of these workshops. So Sandra Lee was is going to be the guest speaker in this coming up one. And so much wisdom was shared by so many of these teachers. And we're going to have these guest speakers coming. The guest speaker series are going to be available to listen to in Brave Patch coming up. And I just wanted to share that with you and just that dynamic community. And finally, I just wanted to say, it's all going to go to the dump someday, folks. This is where it all ends up. So make the most of it. Use your stash, make some beautiful quilts, because if you make some beautiful quilts, it'll stay out of the landfill a little bit longer. Believe me, I've saw a lot of quilting stash in the dump. So if you've got stash already, start using it up. Make your quilts now. Don't save it. Make them. And, eventually it'll all go there. It's kind of humbling. But we make the most of what we have in this world and enjoy your creative life. Yay. So what are your questions, folks?
Oh, that was so much fun to get to hear everyone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Sherri, Heidi, and Luke for sharing. That was beautiful. Sherri, I got a technical question for you. Can we be technical for a second?
Yeah, definitely.
Your t-shirt quilts, are you backing those with anything, interfacing?
So if they're like beefy tees and they've still got a lot of life in them, I don't back them. And sometimes I'll do, if I'm having any trouble with them, I may, sometimes I curl around the edges and stuff. I'll use spray starch, heavy duty spray starch, and starch it. You just have to be patient when you use spray starch because it absorbs a lot and it takes a long time. But once it's in there, it stiffens it a little bit. But you may be fine without spray starch. But the thinner stuff, like the cheaper type of t-shirts you might get at the Gap or something, those thin ones usually need to be interfaced. I like this kind of knit iron-on interfacing, or anything that's worn out. You'll want to interface.
Yeah.
Or put another material behind it, because if it's worn out and there's holes, you can have the sort of secondary material behind it. And I use spray glue sometimes to put pieces together. And once it dries, it doesn't gum your needle up. Just make sure it's acid free.
That sounds good. And somebody suggested glue stick. You know, so when you're making do, when you're repurposing and you're being resourceful, think of every tool in your tool bag. Yeah, I love the spray glue, glue stick. Why not, right? See what happens. Experiment.
And I wanted to answer a little bit to Zach's earlier conversation about ironing, pressing. My sort of glib, because people ask a lot about, because I use a lot of substrate, same as all y'all. And you know, the question comes up a lot about ironing. What do you do if you've got a thick next to a thin, if you've got a color next to, and my answer is if you iron from the top, the fabric's going to go the way it wants to go. If it's thick, it's going to push its way under the thin, and you don't have to micromanage that fabric at all. Let it breathe, let it talk, iron it from the top, and you're good to go.
That's my philosophy too, Luke. That's what I do. And it works better with improv, especially because we're not designing everything to meet up at a certain point and turn in exactly the same way to get precision. This quilting is not about precision in my book. It's about, you know, creative expression. And it's like freedom line, right? Just let it go. Don't micromanage.
As a collaboration, you know, like even these pieces that I found at the museum, and they just were that shape. And I think the more collaborative that I get to be, the more fun I have. And then it's not me thinking I want it to be this way, and if it's not the way it was in my head, then it's wrong. But to instead show up curious and with that spirit of collaboration, which I feel like you guys do that too.
And Zach, I want to read one of the questions from the chat, which I thought was interesting. You may have seen it. They ask if you'd ever revisit your found fabric projects with medical masks, with the kind of masks, you know, I mean, you know, they probably, I don't know that they're littering the streets of New York, but you certainly will have access to drifts of those, you know.
I think it's a brilliant idea. I think it's so funny that this time last year, we were clamoring for masks. And now you can't take 3 steps down the sidewalk without stepping on a discarded one. I mean, it's just funny how quickly our values can shift. To answer that question, though, I'm going to save that project for somebody else. I'm up to my eyeballs. I got no shortage of ideas, I'll tell you that. But it's a good one, no doubt about it.
Gabby has an interesting question. She's asking, what are your recommendations for storing or organizing these materials? I have piles and piles of secondhand textiles and clothes.
I've been storing things based on types of materials. Like I have my corduroy together, I have my men's shirts together. Although, I don't know if you guys know who Eli Leon was, but he had one of the major collections of African-American quilts, including Rosie Lee Tompkins, and all of his collection now is at the Berkeley Art Museum. But in his attic, it was like knee-high in fabric and stuff. And when I went up there, I saw all kinds of bags after he died, all kinds of bags of materials, and they were just collected it by color. So there was like an orange bag that had orange corduroy and orange cotton and orange polyester, and it was just beautiful. Each bag was a different color, and there was all different kinds of materials in it. So I think that's an interesting way too.
That's how I do it. I cut all of my clothing up into 6-inch strips because I'm never going to use anything bigger, and I store it by color, by strip. So I have these just bins of 6-inch strips cut from all of the clothing and sheets and towels and, you know, dresses and suits and whatever, cut up and stored by color type.
I would definitely add on, yeah, process the clothes as fast as you can, right? Like go ahead and get it manageable for yourself somehow. I'm gonna, you know, we talked about another topic in the future for one of these chats might be our quilty nerdy side. And I definitely have some organizational nerdiness happening. So I'm not gonna say too much about it, but I will say that one of the pleasant surprises to having all these fresh direct bags around is that I now, when I get commissions for different memory stores, every customer gets their own bag. And so it just helps me stay very organized that way.
Yeah. I like to cut the bulk out. Like, you know, if I'm not going to use, I don't use waistbands usually, or, you know, certain parts of clothing I don't use. And, but I have to say, when I saw these bags of clothes in Eli's attic, you know, I'd pick up a blue shirt and there would just be like a square cut out here and a you know, like it was just like somebody just went in and cut out a section that they needed and then put the shirt back in. And I was like, that's pretty free. Yeah. Kind of like that.
We were just in an exhibition together at the Wisconsin Museum of Quilts and Fiber Art. And my quilt that I made in India was there. And it was so special to see the quilt that you had on display with those piles of fabric. You know, from him and from Rosie. It was just so potent and striking to see in person those supplies in an art setting.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that. I hadn't heard anything about that show, so I'm glad.
I was there. I was seeing it. I also watched Luke's conversation that you just had with my friend Frank Juarez in his Art Doze setting, and you talked a lot about that interior space that you worked on. So it's two fun Milwaukee connections for both of you, even though you guys are from the South.
Yeah. I want to touch on Denise asked, what do we do? I'm one ahead of you, Denise. Catherine asked, never been to the dump. Any tips for a total beginner? Well, I would like to say that the dump is not the exclusive purview of found material. In fact, I would say don't go to the dump. There's a lot of dumps that have access points. Most of them don't. You are going to be in a field of rotting garbage with trucks that will not you. It is dangerous. It is gross. I mean, you know, it's just broken glass and food from a year ago.
Recology, they don't even allow people to scavenge the dump, just the artists, because it's such a liability. So that's not a place you're going to be able to get stuff. But why don't we rattle off places?
Well, I'm just, my favorite is the Goodwill Outlet, which is by the pound, or there's the same Salvation Army. I have a bunch of there's a Red Racks here that says after it's gone through the whole cycle and no one's bought it for a certain amount of time, they send it to these by the pile things. And that's great. I mean, guiltless buying because it's already been through several iterations of repurpose and you can cut it up how you're willy-nilly.
Have a swap, a clothing swap. Mm-hmm. And at the end, there's always, with your friends, once we can gather, at the end, there's always a bunch of clothing that nobody wants that then has to go to the dump. That's when you get to pick all of the clothes you want for your quilts.
I agree. I think friends are just the best resource. This shirt that I'm wearing is from my friend Amanda, who was on her way to Goodwill, and she was like, should I pop by your house on the way? And I realized to be careful with that kind of thing because she brought in 7 big bags of stuff into my living room. And so I did have to bring some of it over to the Goodwill after sorting through. And I probably let it sit 3 months. And a faster turnaround time would be better. But I made this out of a dress and it's shown up in a bunch of my quilts ever since. And like friends and family is more than enough fabric that I could have. And then once people on Instagram are like, hey, Heidi, I know you like this kind of thing. Can I mail you a care package? And there's some beautiful fabrics from Florida that are repurposed things that were mailed to me.
You'd also be surprised how much you already have. Go to your own closet for a shop-a-thon. It'll give you something that you haven't given yourself permission to get rid of, because maybe you'll lose the weight, grow taller, grow shorter, you know, whatever. Use it yourself, then you're not getting rid of it. So there you go, win-win.
Yeah, and tax tip for any of you who are professionals who do take, you know, if you have a business, a quilt business or something, if you use repurposed clothing, you get to you can take a tax break on every piece of fabric, linen, clothing, sheets, or anything you buy, because ultimately it can be a quilt someday, right? Do you do that, Luke?
I didn't know about that.
I do. I mean, I don't know. Maybe I would get in trouble, but what?
I knew there was a discount for donating. I did not know that there was a discount for you.
Well, you know, you get to take a write-off for materials, right? That you actually use in your work, in your creative work. Mm-hmm. So I figure it's someday anything I've ever bought to wear or use in my home is potential material. So my accountant cleared it anyway. So
could we circle back to this question that Amy Ruth asked back in the middle of our presentations that gets to the heart of stories in quilts and memories in quilts? Because we've been talking the last few minutes about the technical aspects, but there are also histories and stories and memories. And her question was, I'll just read it because it was way back up. She says, all of your stories so enhance the impact of looking at the objects themselves. Do you think about how people who don't know the background of the fabric will interpret what you see? Does it matter if they don't know the story? And I like this, what I think Amy is getting at. I mean, we could take this a number of different directions, but what can we do to keep the stories with the quilts? What are some ideas that people have? Maybe you have ideas at home, you can type it in the chat. Because I personally feel that stories and memory are intricately linked. And there've been some ways that I've seen people work with that before.
I will say, I think that, you know, when I do a lot of bereavement work with folks, and I do think that people's clothing tell a lot of stories, even if you don't know the full story. You know stuff about generation, you know gender, sometimes you know socioeconomic, sometimes you know cultural background. So there's more story there than meets the eye for folks that, when you look at these, that you don't know the story for. So, and then there's also, I think, several of the speakers at the Making Do series said things like this, that there's a sense of humanity and community that's part of these materials. So if you don't know the specific story, it's okay. And, you know, one thing about repurposing materials from your local thrift, I've got one 5 minutes away from me. There's probably my neighbor's clothes in there. So without knowing the full background, I can feel connected to the people in my neighborhood, even though I don't know the story of each individual clothing.
And Zach, I think to answer the question you offered, that's the role of the artist maker, right? I mean, that's our literal task, is to take that clothing and explain using it to a viewer. And sometimes it can be an intimate viewer user, like, you know, the t-shirts, or the one, Sherri, you showed of the clothing that person actually passed away in. The parent, the family had a different intimate experience with that. But I think that, you know, it's the kind of task of the maker to help explain, right? You can be very overt and write on it. You can make a portrait of them, or it can be very abstract. You know, Zach, some of the quilts, the one that you showed that was kind of the sea glass, I think that if you come up close to it, you can say, that's fabric that was clothing And then, as a viewer, no labels, no one, no one explaining it to you, you can start to create your own narrative. And it's going to be different, obviously, but not necessarily far off in that, a quilt made of clothes, you can look and sort of, start your own narrative. So I think there's a lot to be found in just the object. And I think that you can, as a maker, push that as far as you want. If you even want to just write their entire biography on it with stitching, or all the way down to it just being the clothing, over to it being cut so abstractly that it's kind of hard to tell that it was clothing to begin with. And all of those are choices that allow the viewer to have a different entry point.
Yeah, I love those responses. I think, for me, especially just trusting the materials to play their part is an important aspect. And that relating it to other types of art making and other times when I'm working, when I'm doing those other materials, other ideas, I also don't feel like I need to hit someone over the head or be so obvious. When I'm making a painting, do I write everything that it means in the bottom right corner? Like, I trust the viewer to figure out what my abstract painting is about, or like what my ceramics pottery is about. And I think that the more art that you make and the more you get the experience of having a stranger look at the work and share with you what their interpretation is, or even a good friend. I'll send a little photo to Zach and go, what do you see in this? And he'll write me back, like, I see this or that. And that can be a great litmus test of what's coming through. But there's no time where you get to tell people what to think or how to react to the work that you make. And repurposed materials are the same as anything else, I think, in that respect.
Yeah, and sometimes it's okay for the story to be hidden to others. I mean, I think of all of the, older quilts that we see that we don't know the stories behind, that have been made out of clothing straps in the past, sometimes because out of necessity, not quilting fabric, but, things that people had in their homes, those American frontier quilts and stuff. I think, I look at those and I think that was somebody's, christening gown. That was somebody's special Sunday dress. And, and I don't know the real stories behind those, but as long as that quilt was in the family, those stories were probably told, so that the quilt becomes just something that is an object through which stories are told. That they hold the stories and they're known by the families, and then they can be shared in that way. And there's a lot more memory that comes through than I think just looking at a photo, which is a step in just a short spot in time. I think that's one of the lovely aspects of quilting, to build on what you were saying, Heidi. Just think that.
A word I would like to just throw in the mix is the word talisman.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, just an object that holds with it the spirit of what it references, and a quilt, especially made of someone's clothes, is a beautiful version of that.
And, I like to think about how, quilts back before we, got to buying a lot of stuff off the bolt, how they kind of marked passages without people being intentional about it, that it was just a way of life that was part of, remembering and marking family history without it being real overtly intentionally that way. Like, it served that purpose. And maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, maybe it was just to keep warm, but it still served that purpose to, carry those family histories and stories. So I love that.
Yeah, thank you.
I would offer, though, and maybe it's because I'm the family historian of my family, but just like we often talk about how quilts made 100 years ago weren't signed, right? We wish we knew who made it. We wish we know the year. We wish they knew where they're living, right? We like knowing some of the logistical details. I made a memory quilt a few months ago in which the client sent me a bunch of fabric from all different family members, several different family members, several different directions. And she was the only one that knew the origin of all these different pieces she was sending me. In the middle of this project, she passes away. And if she hadn't sat down and told me, this was so-and-so's shirt, this was so-and-so's dress, this was so-and-so's work outfit, though that connection would be lost. Sure, the talisman, the spirit, all of that energy still remains 100%, but now there were those details. And so I ended up, just for her, making kind of a swatch panel on the back of the quilt with the main fabrics from the front and labeling, this was so-and-so's dad, so-and-so, you know, and
that's nice.
Especially for a memory quilt, I think that's
yeah,
a value.
Yeah, I think that's lovely. I love that.
Just about at time, and I have changed my view from speaker to gallery because it's so lovely getting to see everyone. And so I would encourage you guys as well to just take a moment and take a look at our community. A couple people, small handful left after an hour, but like how beautiful that there's so many of us are still logged on. It's such wonderful evidence that you guys were interested the whole way through. And it's really beautiful to see your work. I wonder if, in the closing in the chat, if maybe there's a word that we used in conversation that resonated with you, or maybe like 3 words of something that you learned or you want to remember that resonated. I would love to get, just give everyone an opportunity to share again in the chat. Something that was memorable. Yeah, there we go. Talesman, recontextualization, don't micromanage the fabric. Let the fabric speak.
Sweet.
Old clothing and a pair of scissors. That was so beautiful, Sherri.
The chat has been great, you guys. There's been so much good. I mean, it's hard to respond to all of it, but it's been so fascinating. Your ideas and what your focus is.
And we can continue this conversation online. I know many people, not everybody, but many people are on Instagram. You can find all of us on Instagram, and we're happy to engage. We're human beings who like to talk about quilts and repurposing. So we'll be sending out an email in the next 24 hours-ish with a link to the recording of this chat. So if there's something you missed, you had to step out of the room for a minute, you wanted to hear Sherri talk about those beautiful quilts again, then you can watch the video and that'll be coming your way. And you'll also have links in there to how to contact any of the 4 of us if you would like to follow up with anything we've talked about here tonight.
Yeah, and I just hope you guys, embrace. I'm so excited to see so many people here. It's so wonderful to see people embracing repurposed materials in their quilting.
Yeah, and it's going to be on my YouTube channel is the place where the recording will be. And how amazing if you guys could add a comment in that space on YouTube where you will have access to continually see that space, have a recording of the chat. So please, feel welcome to share a little bit longer in that space. We did have a question with someone asking what our Instagrams are. And if you type in our names, you'll find us, but that will also be in the follow-up letter. Thank you to Sherri for being our guest.
Oh my gosh, what a pleasure it's been. I'm so excited about the talks that you guys are doing, and thank you. It's been such an honor to be talking with the 3 of you. I admire all of your work so much for so long.
Likewise.
And we got the idea for this subject because it was in the chat last time. So maybe one last flurry in the chat. What else would you like us guys to talk about? I know Zach hinted around our quilt nerd idea.
The very next one, though, is going to be part 2 of this sustainable sewing series, which will be zero waste. So spinning off a little bit about how can we not just repurpose material, but how can we use those little bits and those scraps and the odd things that we have floating around our life and our orbit. So how can you use those in your art and in your quilt? So that'll be the next topic coming up in June.
Yeah.
Right.
All right. Thank you guys so much.
Have a good night. Have a good day.
It was fun. Have a great weekend, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.